what I'm going to talk about is these two ideas, these two concepts, Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy. And it's a perfectly fitting thing to talk about in this year. This year, earlier in May, it was the 100th anniversary of the May 4th movement of 1919, which was an anti-imperialist series of protests triggered by the Treaty of Versailles, when parts of China that had fallen under German control were given to Japan rather than returned to Chinese control at the end of World War I, which infuriated young Chinese and older Chinese too, because China had been on the side of the Allies in World War I. And World War I, President Wilson of the United States had been saying that one of the things that the war was supposed to accomplish was to end empires, was to allow countries to determine their own fate, and the people of countries to determine their own fate. But when the victorious powers met in Paris to work on the Treaty of Versailles, they made it clear that what actually was going to happen was that European peoples would be encouraged to control their own fate, and places outside of Europe would sometimes be transferred from one imperial power to another. And this is what happened with Shandong, parts of Shandong in China. And these were symbolically important places, in part because it's part of Shandong is Confucius's homeland. So here you had a real heartland part of China being transferred from German control, and when the Germans were defeated, to Japanese control. And so you had people in Shandong not getting the right of self-determination, China, at the end of World War I, but being transferred from being controlled by one foreign power to being controlled by another foreign power. And I think, keep in mind this idea of anger at being shifted from being controlled by one foreign power to another foreign power and not being able to control your own fate. Because that, jumping forward to 2019, is what I think infuriates many people in Hong Kong right now, is they felt that they were they were part of the British Empire, and the head of the most powerful man in Hong Kong was a man appointed by London for a long period of time. And after 1997, unlike most former colonies, Hong Kong did not start to decide who should run their community, but instead it was somebody basically appointed by Beijing. And even though people in Hong Kong, many of them are of Chinese descent, not all of them, they're people who are Hong Kongers who trace their descent back to South Asia, back to Europe, to England, but also to other parts of Europe. There's a feeling now that what happened was not an end of colonialism as much as it was a shift from one form of colonialism to a quite different form of colonialism, but still not being able to control your own fate. So one feeling in Hong Kong now, it's not the only one, is that it's a replay of 1919 in that sense, 100 years later. Even though when the 100th anniversary of the May 4th movement was marked on the Chinese mainland, what Xi Jinping and others said was, everything has changed since 1919. The world has changed since 1919. Now it's China that can stand up in world affairs, and the dreams of people in 1919 have been realized because the Chinese people now control their own fate the way they didn't in 1919. So another thing that happened in 1919 during the May 4th movement, there was a political struggle to try to protest the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. But one thing that happened quite quickly was police suppressed the first protest, arrested students who gathered at Tiananmen, by the Gate of Heavenly Peace, Tiananmen. And the police roughed up the students, arrested them, and one student died of injuries that day. So the May 4th movement of 1919 quickly became a struggle for the right to protest itself. and it spread to other parts of China as well. That too, the Hong Kong protests of this year began on a specific dislike of a bill, of a law, comparable, say, to dislike of a treaty. But then it quickly became a struggle for the right to protest itself and against police brutality. So there are other kinds of echoes between 1919 and 2019. What I want to focus on is around the time of the May 4th movement, while this political movement and protest was going on, there was also a call for cultural renewal. And people said, what is it that explains why China has stayed weak and can be bullied by other countries of the world? What would China have to do to be, once again, one of the world's strong countries rather than a weak country? And a lot of intellectuals at the time said what China needed to do that was to have more of science that the West had. One reason why the West seemed to be more powerful is they had better technologies, more advanced technologies, and also a spirit of scientific inquiry, of questioning tradition, of looking for the best ideas available in the world. Science was international. You looked anywhere for what could help you. And they needed democracy. And that, in Chinese, the term for democracy, minju, means character for people and a character for rule. And it can mean many different things. It can mean, as it can in English and other languages, democracy can mean elections, and some people thought of that. It can also just mean rulers who are more responsive to what the people want. There's a tradition in China going back to Mencius that the ruler rules by the grace of heaven, but heaven sees with the eyes and hears with the ears of the people. It actually Mencius, it goes back further than Mencius, but Mencius popularized it. So what they needed, they said, was more science and more democracy. And this could mean a variety of things: better technology, new kind of inquiry, free inquiry, elections, or at least perhaps just rulers who really listened to the people. And they felt that the warlords who were in control in 1919 were not fulfilling democracy in any of those ways. So the idea of Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy were the things that China needed more of, is also associated with the May 4th movement 100 years ago. So what I'm going to talk about is what the state of Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy in China, in the People's Republic of China, as it marks its 70th anniversary. What's the state of that, and how is it being thought about on the mainland, particularly in Beijing, where today there was a giant parade, a carefully orchestrated parade filled with military displays. And while in Hong Kong, there are right now, as since the day October 1st is still going on in Asia, the parade, I think, is over. But in Hong Kong, there are mass actions of a different kind. So here are a couple of images from this morning. People give talks, they give variations of the same talks, different places. This is just part of academic life. But I always want to ensure that an audience knows that they're hearing some things and seeing some things that the presenter has never presented before. So these are images from this morning from the internet showing Hong Kong protesters defying police to call for greater freedom on China's National Day. This was something that Time magazine published. And then there's also an image of the parade in the mainland. And these are contrasting kinds of images. And one way you could read it is that in Beijing, there's more focus on Mr. Science right now, defined in a very specific way, not as free inquiry questioning tradition necessarily, but technology. And saying that in part, one of the things the Chinese Communist Party would say is the world is still, don't forget 1919, don't forget how China used to be pushed around by other countries. Don't forget what happened when China was disunified, it was divided under the warlords, and it was lagging behind in terms of technology. Look at how we've arrived, and displays of state-of-the-art military technology is one thing that speaks to how different things are than 1919. While in Hong Kong, you could say that what people are saying in part is, what about Mr. Democracy? That's what seems to have been forgotten. And there are other images. So Xi Jinping gave a speech today in which he talked about no force can stop the country's progress. He also emphasized the unity of China, of the People's Republic of China. And he even talked about, he brought up Hong Kong. He mentioned that the one country, two systems system is working. Just look at Hong Kong and Macau. It's true, both Hong Kong and Macau are former colonies that are now supposed to be enjoying a high degree of autonomy while being part of the People's Republic of China. And as that's imagined from Beijing, what that means is they have some distinctive functions. They might have different kinds of economies, but in political terms, they're part of the one country. Whereas the two systems really just means economics. The people in Hong Kong are disputing that, and they say, we actually have our own distinctive rule of law, right of assembly, and to protest. And this is a thorn in the side of Xi Jinping when there are protests there. Macau works better than that. Macau, from Xi Jinping's point of view, Macau has a distinctive kind of economic structure, but politically, there's very little pushback. There is a small amount of pushback there, but it's small, it's controlled. One thing that Macau has that's special is it has gambling casinos. It also has a replica of Venice, the Venezia, which I went to right after going to the real Venice, and then I've come back to this one. So I've made 3 trips to Venice this year. And it's very funny to go there. It's actually quite bizarre. I went to Macau on June 4th, the anniversary, another 9-year that I'll talk about, 1989. There were large-scale protests in Tiananmen and other places across China, and then there was a massacre on June 4th. On the mainland, you can't say anything, you can't gather to commemorate the massacre of June 4th. It's a totally taboo subject. One thing that makes Hong Kong and Macau different is that you can talk about the massacre, and newspapers will run something about the massacre. But in very muted forms in Macau, very loud forms in Hong Kong. There's a vigil on June 4th to commemorate the martyrs. It can't take place on the mainland. It can take place in Macau, but it's a very small one, and in Hong Kong, a very big one. So this year on June 4th, I decided to spend part of the day in Macau and part of the day in Hong Kong. And so I took the ferry from Hong Kong to Macau, and I went on the internet. I had a cell phone that had a SIM card that could work in both places. And I was wondering, I know that all Tiananmen-related sites are blocked on the mainland. I know that you can access any of them in Hong Kong. What about Macau? On Macau, the internet worked fine, just like it did basically at home, and I could find things about Tiananmen. I looked up The Gate of Heavenly Peace, a documentary film about Tiananmen that's banned on the mainland but can be seen in other places. But an interesting happened. I was in the casino area, visiting Venice, and I thought I would see what a newspaper was like that covered what is a Macau daily newspaper. There was no way to find a newspaper to buy anywhere in the gambling area, which is largely where mainland visitors to Macau spend their time. And in the luxury stores, malls, there was nothing. I couldn't find any kind of magazine stand or newspaper. And admittedly, the idea is you're supposed to be obsessing with pleasure and gambling, but still, it was striking how far you had to go to see one of these newspapers that did cover things about Tiananmen. I found out later from a friend who bought me a newspaper. But so you have in Macau, I think, the way that Xi Jinping would like one country, two systems to work, where even if there are the ability to see what's on the internet, nobody's going to bother doing it. And even though there's the ability to hold a vigil, very few people will do it. This will just be a kind of eccentric thing. Whereas in Hong Kong, there's such a focus. So these are some images also on from this morning checking Twitter. What the Chinese Communist Party hoped was that globally, the big story today would be the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the founding of the PRC. But actually you have split screens where half the screen is showing what's happening in Beijing and half the screens are showing what's happening in Hong Kong. So the Hong Kong protests have thrown a thorn in the side of Xi Jinping. Some of the newspapers have said they're raining on the parade. On the other hand, though, the biggest audience, or the most important audience for the parade in Beijing is people within the mainland itself, and they don't see a split screen. All they see is the parade. And when they hear news about Hong Kong, there's another kind of contrast. When they hear news about Hong Kong, there have been a small number of violent incidents by protesters. Those are shown over and over again in the Chinese media. Largely in the Western media, those are played down and the violence of the police are shown. So you could have another split screen where you said what's being shown on the Chinese media and what's being shown on the Western media, and it's quite divided. So one of the people I'm following, people who are on the scene in Hong Kong, one of them is Sebastian Weg, who has written wonderfully on Hong Kong, and he's just gone there to spend to be there for a few days ago. It was the 5th anniversary of the Umbrella Movement of 2014. So there are big protests, and today this. But another person I'm following on Twitter who's gone back there, who's written a lot of very good writings on Tiananmen. She wrote a book about the memory of Tiananmen, and she's writing very, very good pieces on Hong Kong, her native city, is Louisa Lim, who's going to be one of the people on the panel with me at Ferrara on Sunday, as will a young Taiwan journalist named Brian Hio, who will be part of that panel as well. And so it's the panel is, my Italian I will not try to read, revolt, it seems to me it reads revolts on the periphery. In the English translation is, I think, revolt in the suburbs, which is an interesting, it's like the mind, anyway. And we'll talk about the tensions in Taiwan as well as Hong Kong, at the worry about how strong China is with new technologies. Here is a tweet from Louisa Lim from this morning, talking about how the protest isn't that big, it's just tens of thousands of people. But you have to remember all of the subway lines, major subway lines, have been closed down in Hong Kong by the police to try to prevent people from gathering. That there's been week after week of protests that exhaust people, and there's been week after week of tear gas being used. So you could say only tens of thousands have turned out, or you can say it's amazing that tens of thousands of people care so much still about Mr. Democracy that they'll go out even though they're taking great risks now. And this other picture is of Brian Hio, the other person who'll be on at the Internazionale Festival. And each of them have had pieces translated in Internazionale. And he's just arrived from Taiwan to Hong Kong. And the first thing you see when you get to the Hong Kong airport is Hong Kong, Asia's world city. And that suggests that Hong Kong is a city that's as advanced as you can be in sort of all global metrics, and has a state-of-the-art subway system, one of the best in the world. But right now, while in Beijing, another way to think about the contrast to today, while in Beijing, the parade emphasizes all the kind of advanced technologies of Beijing, the sort of symbol of advanced technology in Hong Kong, the subway system, transport, has been shut down. So it's not just that there's a focus on Mr. Science, but it's almost a kind of blocking of the parts of Mr. Science in Hong Kong. And just how advanced Hong Kong is technologically, I'll just do a little bit of personal contrast. When I first went to Shanghai in 1986, I took a side trip to Hong Kong. And when I was in Shanghai, nothing looked futuristic. Everything, there were buildings from the past, but many things, getting around the town was slower than anything I'd experienced in a major city I'd been in before. It was harder to make a phone call. It was harder to get to the university I lived in. You had to take a bus. There was no subway. You got to Hong Kong, and it was like returning to familiarity then. And also I saw some things that seemed futuristic, that actually seemed like, if anything, if you were time traveling in Shanghai, you were time traveling to the past. If you were in Hong Kong and you were time traveling, it was to the future. There were light shows on the skyscrapers, all kinds of things. Now this is kind of reversed. When I go to Shanghai, Shanghai has gone from having no subway system to having the biggest subway system in the world. It now has futuristic looking buildings, so much so that when Hollywood wants to make a movie set in the future, it will often film it in Pudong. The movie Her was filmed there that way. Hong Kong still seemed like, more of a match. The two places seemed like a match. Oh, and also you couldn't make a phone call easily in Shanghai, but now, as long as you're not trying to use sites that the internet blocks, the internet can work in some ways even faster and better at some times for doing some things than in the West. But Hong Kong still, was up to speed with cities around the world in terms of getting places. But now, in a strange way, if you go to Hong Kong, it's very hard to get around. It's like going back in time. And though the internet hasn't been blocked, you suddenly have to worry about, will there come a time when it is blocked? But just how advanced, so it's a very striking thing. China, the parade in Beijing is about saying, look, we used to be a country that was being left behind in so many ways, but look at how we are now a match for any country in the world, technologically and military, and catching up, and surpassing some of the countries that used to lord it over us in the time when China was affected by imperialism. For a semi-colonial country to be at a par with or more advanced than the former colonizers is a very exciting thing. In Hong Kong, too, there was a way in which, even though it wasn't freed from colonialism, it was no longer in any sense kind of behind Britain. I got a sense of that in May. I was in Britain and I was taking the subway there to the airport. And I didn't have an internet connection that would work, and I didn't know which terminal I was in. And so there was just a man who looked about my age and looked British, and he was messing with his smartphone, so I assumed he was using the internet. So I said, "Excuse me, sir, do you mind checking to see which terminal my plane leaves from?" He says, "Oh, I can't get connection while taking the tube. What do you think this is, Hong Kong?" I hadn't mentioned Hong Kong at all. He just said he was actually traveling between Hong Kong and London. In his mind, going from London to Hong Kong was going back to a place that really worked technologically. Okay, I'll return to these things, but first a little bit more going back into history and then forward. So the May 4th movement of 1919 that I talked about is something that is celebrated by the Chinese Communist Party. This Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy. We might say, in the West, but the Communist Party doesn't have democracy. The People's Republic of China doesn't have democracy. How can they celebrate an event that was about science and democracy? But again, remembering that idea of democracy can mean a government that listens to and serves the people and thinks of the people's interests. The Chinese Communist Party says, actually, China has democracy. Democracy is one of the slogans, one of the keywords for Xi Jinping. And there are posters up talking about democracy that I saw on my last trip to China. And they had a poster for each of Xi Jinping's key terms. And the poster for democracy showed a group of people all raising their hands to vote, all voting the same way. So the Chinese Communist Party does have democracy. Xi Jinping was elected. He was just elected by a group of old men who decided which old man should be the next leader. So the science and democracy movement, the Chinese Communist Party says it is fulfilling the dreams of those students of 1919. And on the anniversary, they have things like this commemorative stamp. In the center of Tiananmen Square, there is a monument to the heroes of the Chinese Revolution, and one of the friezes on that shows young people in 1919 calling for better government and a country that could stand up against foreign powers. This is a shot an image tweeted by one of the leading art historians of China, Craig Clunas, about that statue being created after 1949 at the place where the students had gathered in 1919. So that was a way of saying, we are making concrete the dreams of that earlier generation. And this is the monument in the center of Tiananmen Square. Different sides of it show different heroic scenes from the Chinese past. It's a way of saying, here is the official version of Chinese history. Here are the heroes that you should try to emulate. In 1989, students gathered right in front of that statue in late April and May and early June of 1989. And one thing they did was on May 4th, the 70th anniversary of the May 4th movement, another 70th anniversary, they issued a new May 4th proclamation in which they said, the Chinese Communist Party, essentially, the Chinese Communist Party claims to represent the ideals of 1919, but they seem to have forgotten them, especially Mr. Democracy. We represent the spirit of that. We are the continuers of that 1919 legacy. So that was a time of sort of dueling, another time of dueling markings of a day. Just as today, there's an official celebration in Beijing and a counter kind of anti-celebration in Hong Kong. In 1989, on May 4th, there were a group of Communist Party leaders who met beside the square in a grand building to say, look at how we represent the goals of 1919. China now stands on its own feet and is a strong country. And out on the square, people were saying, no, we are the ones who represent the ideals of 1919. We are fighting for democracy and to make China truly, truly modern. And part of this idea, if we boil it down, is what does it mean to be a modern country? This was what people in 1919, students and their opponents all said, what China needs to do is find a formula to stay both somehow Chinese and to become modern. We need to figure out a way to save our nation by modernizing it. And the idea of having a strong modern nation has been something that people in China have been struggling for from the 19th century on, from the time China started being defeated by foreign powers, most humiliatingly by Japan. So by 1989, Deng Xiaoping, then leader, said, we've arrived. Deng Xiaoping was a student of that 1919 generation. And he said, we've come up with a recipe. We are both modern and still Chinese. We've come up with a way to save the nation. But one thing that students did to mock him was to say, actually, Deng Xiaoping, you're behaving like an old emperor, or like the Empress Dowager, because Deng Xiaoping wasn't formally the head of the country, just like the Empress Dowager in the end of the Qing wasn't the formal head of the country, but was calling the shots. So they mocked him with posters like these. But again, the heroic version of 1919 that the Communist Party puts forward are in images such as this, where the students and the posters there, the banners they're holding say down with imperialism, down with the unequal treaties, and also down with Confucian ideas. Because one of the things the students in 1919 thought was that Confucian traditions were holding China back, that it was getting in the way of science. Here's just another image of that, of the protests of that time. Here's one of the pivotal books on the May 4th movement that talks about these things. One of the things, many ways in which the students of 1919 were trying to break away from certain traditions, Confucian traditions. Women played a role in the marches, and the students of that generation, including a young Mao Zedong, called for female equality and called for an end to Confucian marriage practices that were discriminatory against women. One of the first things Mao ever wrote was about a woman who had committed suicide because she couldn't stand being part of an arranged marriage. The students, another kind of modern thing they did was to try to reach out to workers and try to bring them into the movement too. So you have in the official story of the May 4th movement, you have certain things that are played up about the movement. It's seen as this kind of pure struggle for democracy, for science, and for an end to imperialism. Movements, social movements, are always messier than that. Just as I could easily give a talk about the Hong Kong protests because I have sympathy with them, in which I don't mention that protesters have engaged in any kind of violent actions, but they have. Police have done much more brutality, and it's a matter of balance. But I think there's a tendency sometimes to people to create pure heroes out of things that sort of, not just whether they're heroes or not, but make them paragons of virtue. And I think it's important to realize that it's just common for there to be messiness to historical subjects. So there are some partly or fully missing May 4ths, I think, when people look back to 1919. It's often remembered as a Beijing event. Beijing people are very proud of it, but it actually took place across the country. It started in Beijing, then spread to all other parts of the country where there were universities. There was a rowdy May 4th. During the protest of May 4th itself, the students trashed the home of an official that they saw as being too weak in the face of Japan. There was a xenophobic May 4th. I mean, protesters, again, this is something, again, with Hong Kong. You'll hear somebody talk about, well, in Hong Kong, there seems to be some people who are just expressing nastiness about mainlanders as though they look down on them as lesser people. And there is some of that. It's not the main theme of it, but there is some of that. Well, in May 4th, this great heroic moment that's celebrated, there was some of that as well. There was a Chinese intellectual who remembers at the time that he had a Japanese girlfriend, and this was seen as traitorous at the time, even by students who claimed to be all about cosmopolitanism and connecting to the world. There was a rumor that went around in Shanghai that the Japanese were poisoning the water, and there was somebody beaten up by a crowd because they thought he was Japanese. He was actually Korean. So, you know, this is part, even the most admirable movements have some of those problems. There was a May 4th movement that started in 1918. 1919, we often think of moments when movements start, but movements actually often have sort of dress rehearsals. Before 1989, there was 1986, where people sort of familiarized themselves with tactics. Before the 2019 protests in Hong Kong, there was the Umbrella Movement in 2014. Sometimes the same people are involved in these things, sometimes different people, but sometimes word gets around about that. So there was even a Confucian traditionalist May 4th. Even while the May 4th activists said, we're breaking with Confucianism, if you look carefully at how they behaved, of course they were influenced by the traditions. When students went on strike in Shanghai in 1919, they set aside an hour each day for self-cultivation. They wanted to show that even though they were on strike, they were not abandoning their role as sort of careful Confucian scholars, they were just expanding their education. This is the same thing that we've seen in Hong Kong during this movement. Hong Kong protesters say, don't think of us as Chinese. What they really mean is don't think of us as Chinese in the way the Communist Party defines it. But many things they've done in protests now, but also in 2014, fit into this pattern of the students behaving in some ways like Confucian scholars in the making. In 2014, the Umbrella Movement, I went there, I saw a study area set aside for students who were on strike but didn't want to fall behind in their classes. Just to give you an idea, in 1960s student strikes in Italy, France, and America, the idea was that when students went on strike, this was like the opposite of being careful students worrying about exams. And if they had classes, they were radical teach-ins the other way. There were teach-ins in the Umbrella Movement as well, but when people talked about the incredible politeness of students on strike in Hong Kong in 2019, I thought these seemed like the people that I wrote about when I wrote my dissertation about the Shanghai students of 1919 rather than 2019. I'm just rushing through some of this, but I want to say that in a way, the same thing has happened with kind of reducing a complicated, messy movement to a simple story. and forgetting how many strands it has happened with 1989 as well. And these are the images that are sort of boiled down, that people remember now internationally about the movement of 1989. There was a goddess of democracy put up in the square, and then there was a massacre where a man stood up in front of a line of tanks. So there's a way in which Tiananmen is remembered as a student democracy movement, or as simply as a massacre. And sometimes when people say, will there be another Tiananmen, all they mean is, will there be a massacre? When Hong Kong in 2014, the umbrella movement, when magazines and newspapers would say, are Hong Kong protests headed for Tiananmen? What they meant was a shorthand for, will there be a massacre? The other thing that Tiananmen is sometimes seen outside of China as being a shorthand for is the government lying about things. This is from the Simpsons television show, which actually has, to show how large Tiananmen looms in the Western imagination, even though it's something that's either suppressed talk about it in the mainland China, or sometimes people know a fair amount of, at least a bit about it, but say, why are foreigners so obsessed with it? That was a small thing in the grander story of Chinese history. But how obsessed, how focused Westerners are. The Simpsons actually had 2 episodes or at least 2 images. Another shows Marge Simpson standing in front of a line of tanks, like the Tank Man. But there too, there are missing 1989s. There was a multi-class 1989. The fact that workers were part of the movement was very important. It's remembered sometimes as a student movement, but it was also a worker movement. Same as in 1919, what gave the movement power was that members of other classes thought that the students were speaking for them. There was a multi-local 1989, and there's a map up here of all the cities around China where there were significant protests. 1 million people were on the streets of Beijing, but 500,000 people were on the streets of Shanghai, and dozens of other cities had that. There was a problematic 1989. There were student leaders who set themselves up and treated in a kind of elitist manner, looked down on some of the workers. There were struggles within the student movement. It wasn't the official Beijing version was they were rioters, and the Western response is, no, they weren't. They were really good people who only cared about the nation and about democracy. And the thing was that they were also flawed individuals, and the film Gate of Heavenly Peace gives you a sense of this. It was a patriotic and even nationalistic 1989. When the students took to the streets, they were saying in part, we don't think the Chinese Communist Party right now has the right recipe of making China truly strong and respected in the world. They didn't want to overthrow the Communist Party, but they wanted the Communist Party to connect with a more reformist side of what it had been doing early in the 1980s, rather than what they felt was moving too slow toward that. There was a partly successful 1989. This is sometimes the hardest thing to explain in the West. Why? Because it ended with a massacre, and that was and there was no follow-up movement. But one of the reasons why students came out onto the streets in 1989, they wanted democracy, but they also just wanted more they wanted more personal freedom. They were young people who wanted to be more in step with global youth culture. There was a lot of rock music at the square in Tiananmen in 1989. And what students said was, we want to be able to enjoy the kinds of things young people do. China, if it has advanced enough, should allow us to be free. We should be able to travel. We should be able to do the things that we know young people around the world are doing that we can't. We want to, the university would even interfere sometimes with who was dating whom, and they would try to guide you toward a specific job. And the students wanted more choices in a certain way. That was part of what it could boil down to. The generation after the massacre didn't get the political choices, didn't get the democracy, didn't get the ability to hold movements, but they got to live more of the lifestyle that the students of '89 were dreaming about. So it was a partly successful movement in this odd way that sometimes even when a movement's suppressed, you get some of the things because the government doesn't want to have to face it again. There's the '89 that started in 1986. I mentioned there were protests in '86 that kind of warmed up. And these are important to me in part because I was there to witness those and I wasn't there in 1989. But one of the things that spurred students in 1986 in Shanghai to protest, along with ideas of Fan Lizhi about democracy and this, there was a rock concert, one of the first rock concerts in China by a group called Jan and Dean, an American surf rock band like the Beach Boys. And at the concert, some students in Shanghai were really excited that rock music was something young people around the world were interested in then. And they got to go to the concert. And the band was playing and they got up to dance. And security guards made them sit back down. To them, that symbolized what was an insufficient opening up to the world. If you can go to a rock concert but you can't dance, you aren't really in step with global youth culture. So those kinds of things in other ways, they thought the reforms are connecting to the world but only with business. What about other things? What about things like travel? What about fashion? What about reading books that are available around the world? And they pushed for that kind of thing. So this is just, again, this sense of it being a global, being a multi-local, cross-national thing. One reason I've dwelt on the different aspects of 1989 is a lot of what the Chinese Communist Party has done since 1989 is try to make sure it doesn't have to face that kind of problem again. And that means controlling campuses and controlling students, and that's been part of the story in intellectuals. Another part has been trying to co-opt students and give them some of the things they want so that they are less dissatisfied. But the other thing is, the movement of '89, what really worried the government was that it was taking place at places all around the country. And it was connecting workers and students. It was connecting people of all different social classes. So since 1989, there's at least at sometimes been a little bit of tolerance for protests that only involve one social group or one part of the country, but a very firm crackdown on anything that crosses class lines and geographical lines. That helps explain why Falun Gong was the most was such a strong crackdown in 1999. Falun Gong was the first thing since Tiananmen that was connecting people across the country and across social classes. This is one reason why the Hong Kong protests, as dramatic as they have been, as significant as they have been in 2014 and now, haven't led to the kind of complete crackdown with the center involved rather than just Hong Kong involved that might have happened. Had those protests, the fear of Beijing with the first round of protests and with these two, is that they might spread into the mainland and become something where there were sympathy protests in other places. And if people have expressed any kind of sympathy on the mainland for the Hong Kong protests, they've been arrested very quickly or had their internet postings taken down. But the Chinese Communist Party's nightmare is of a movement that, like 1989, will connect people across the country or across a large part of the country. That hasn't happened with Hong Kong. So it's annoying and it's seen as a threat, but it's not seen as this kind of threat. In 1989, it's important to remember while the Chinese protests were happening, there were protests in places like Poland that did bring down communist parties. And in Poland, solidarity connected people across social classes and across the country. That had a strong crackdown. In places like Xinjiang and Tibet, where there's been the tightest repression in recent years, especially most recently in Xinjiang, where there are large networks of internment camps. One thing that's worrisome to the government about Xinjiang, it's a very large area where there's the potential for people across that area of different social classes to make a common cause, and that's what worries the government most. So the China dream and its discontents, I'm going to just talk about how what Xi Jinping would say China is now that is so worthy of celebrating. And this is a poster I keep coming back to that I think sums it up well. This was in Qufu, Confucius's hometown, in Shandong, the province that was transferred from German control to Japanese control, but is now under Chinese control. And this is an image of China as a country that has state-of-the-art technology, Mr. Science there, in the fastest trains on Earth, some of them, and largest high-speed rail, Modernity is often symbolized by how fast and how far you can go. But it respects its traditions with Confucius. So it's an interesting reworking of the May 4th. May 4th wanted Mr. Science, but also criticized Confucius. The Communist Party has reworked it, that you can have Mr. Science and Mr. Confucius can go together. At the opening ceremonies of the Olympics, you could see a similar thing like that. It was a high-tech display that was supposed to wow the world with China's technological prowess. But in the pageantry, there were some nods to Confucius as well. The high-tech skyline of Shanghai. And there's also a sense that, look, we've arrived. Chinese universities have some of the best state-of-the-art labs for sciences, and this has helped them climb in the world rankings of universities. The Chinese Communist Party was very proud when Tsinghua University and Beijing University made it into the top 20 of the Times Higher Education Supplement rankings. And you have surpassing Japanese universities and Hong Kong universities. And what's staggering for somebody in a field like mine is the situation for people working in political science and history in China right now is more tightly controlled. More topics are taboo than even 10 years ago or 15 years ago. It's more dangerous to be an intellectual questioning the political order. And yet, while I would say that a world-class university should be a place where you can criticize your own country and your own system, and I'm very free to criticize, even as authoritarian as Donald Trump is, I can feel quite free on an American university to criticize Donald Trump. Actually, I'm quite free on a Chinese university to criticize Donald Trump too. But Chinese universities have risen while there's been less and less space for Mr. Democracy. So it's not just that the Chinese Communist Party is saying, if you've got enough of Mr. Science, maybe you don't need Mr. Democracy so much, but a lot of the world seems to be accepting that. The Chinese dream is this idea of you're connecting with the past, you're state-of-the-art, high-tech, but distinctively Chinese. This dream of being modern and distinctively Chinese is connected by Confucianism being back in favor and high-tech modernity. And a kind of possibly partly Confucian reading of democracy. The claim is that the government is listening to the people and helping the people, and that's what people should focus on. But the whole story the Communist Party wants to tell is, look how different things are than in 1949. In 1949, China was backward, it was still being bullied by foreign countries, and now we have arrived. But there's a critique of that, not just in Hong Kong. And this was a thing that showed up on the internet when it was a little less controlled in Hong Kong and in the mainland, which is a series of cartoons about somebody found in an attic from the early 1950s, a display that said, these show you how China was in a nightmare state before 1949 and then a glorious state after liberation. Before 1949, there were corrupt officials under the Nationalist Party. Now there are selfless cadres. Now, when this was put up on the internet, people said, wait, are we living in the before or the after? Because people no longer think that there's no corruption in China. Here, discrimination, before 1949, there was discrimination against the lower classes. There was a sharp divide between rich and poor. But now, after 1949, everyone's equal. And again, the commentaries on the internet went, wait a minute, are we before or after? Because China has enormous disparities now between rich and poor. But there was another image. Before 1949, China was bullied by foreign powers. And here represented by the Nationalist Party was connected to the Americans. But you'd have similar kinds of things about Japan now. After 1949, days are brighter. And the idea is that now Chinese people control their own fate. So now, a lot of those stories that the Communist Party was telling in 1949, 50 to get people to think them legitimate. See how equal society has become. People don't believe that anymore. See how uncorrupt, how selfless the officials are. People don't believe that anymore. But the story that still works is before 1949 we were bullied in the world, and now we aren't. And so military displays and celebrations are a way of saying, look how far we've come. And this was images in 2015, there was a marking of the 70th anniversary, the last 70th anniversary I'll mention, of the end of World War II and Japan's surrender. Xi Jinping presided over a military display, a grand military display. Leaders from the world came there to stand by him. Vladimir Putin came. The head of South Korea, before she was toppled by anti-corruption protests, was there. And this was a way of saying we really have arrived and we have this kind of global role. And this idea of reclaiming a past global role is something that's very important in the narrative of the Chinese Communist Party now. It's something linking up to the Marco Polo Center, which seems a good way to draw this to an end. The idea of a new Belt and Road initiative and a new Silk Road is looking back to another period of Chinese greatness in the past and saying we've returned to that. There's a lot of discussion now in China, the government, instead of like decrying all of the imperial period as backward, instead of decrying Confucius, anything from the past that seems to suggest a kind of time of Chinese greatness is invoked and put into the mix. Confucius, one of the great thinkers of the world. The Silk Road, one of the great moments in world history. The Qing before it was defeated by foreign powers, a flourishing time. All of that is kind of celebrated, and then this is a new golden age, is the argument. But the critique is, but wait, maybe we have some problems of the dark periods, not just of the golden age. And another thing I would say with the Silk Road thing is that the idea of that Silk Road was, the actual Silk Road was one in which influences from different parts of the world influenced each other. Flows of people, ideas, things went freely. One of the places that was a meeting point of cultures where different things flowed freely was Xinjiang, which was not part of, not always part of the Chinese empire, of the Chinese state in any way, shape, or form. That was a place of free exchanges. China was changed by things coming in from the West was changed by things coming in from China. The new Belt and Road idea is one in which, while there are exchanges, Xi Jinping says he loves the Belt and Road, but China needs to guard against too much Western influence from foreign ideas. The Belt and Road is supposed to be a win-win setup, but Xi Jinping and his colleagues make it quite clear that they actually want kind of dependent relationships with places that they give a lot of aid to. They don't want to colonize, but they expect them to line up and vote with them on the UN and things like that. And Xinjiang, rather than being a free space for exchange, has to be a place that things can go through, but only on the terms that Beijing sets. So there's a lot of ways in which different people at different times claim to be continuing something from the past or realizing dreams from the past, but they're only doing a very specific kind of recognition of that. And I would actually argue that if we think of Hong Kong, it's actually has been more of a place where that kind of mutual influence from different parts of the world has been happening more like a high-tech Silk Road of influences. And actually the protests reflect that kind of influence from different places. They're borrowing tactics from different parts of the world and making them localized, and they're spreading their influence to different places where they're being modeled. So Hong Kong obsesses me. I've got a book coming out early next year called Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink. And I'll end with this image, because you'll be seeing enough images of the protests on the news. But I'm delighted by what they came up with it wasn't my idea at all, for the cover of the book. Vigil, the flower at the top is a symbol for the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, and it's supposed to be, the flag has white and it has red on it, the idea being that that's one country, two systems, the red being, the red representing the one country, and white representing two systems. And here you have that flower that's white being dyed redder and redder, so that there's sort of, some people talk in Hong Kong of it one country, two systems has become one country, 1.8 systems, then 1.5 systems, 1.3 systems, and eventually be just one system. And beside that is a picture I took on June 4th in Victoria Park in Hong Kong. A very beautiful moment that was connected to China. Hong Kong, even when Hong Kongers say, don't think of it as Chinese, they're connecting to a Chinese movement by remembering 1989, but they're also fighting their own fight. And you have a city defined largely by lights. There's one thing represented here with candles by people in a park calling for Mr. Democracy. Thanks for your attention. I look forward to questions.